Thank you so much. Thank you guys for coming. I want to talk to you today about the moral dimensions of living in harm's way. And in particular, I want to focus on the long-term dangers of climate change and the responsibilities that individuals are going to have for the risks and dangers that they're going to be facing in a warming world. So let me just start with a bit of background. So over the last few decades, global average temperatures have increased by about 0.8 degrees Celsius, about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's extremely likely that human influences have played a major role in driving that trend, at least since the second part of the 20th century. But what happens from here on out is harder to say. And that's partly because the climate system is very complex. We don't know all of the details of how it works. But partly it's also because the outcomes are going to depend on what we do to control our impacts on the planet. So the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the international body responsible for kind of compiling information about climate change. And when it issues projections about the future, it does so on the basis of a variety of different scenarios, particularly that vary with how much greenhouse gases or how much CO2 in particular human beings are going to emit over the coming years. So what you have here is a chart with the year on the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical axis is the total amount of CO2 that is being emitted in that year. And so you see that these are very different pathways. Maybe we reduce our emissions significantly. Maybe we don't take much action and emissions continue to grow. Maybe somewhere in between. And when you model these different scenarios and kind of see what happens, what you end up coming up with is that the eventual increase in temperature into the future lines up pretty straightforwardly with the amount of CO2 that ends up in the atmosphere, right? So here you have cumulative emissions on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is total temperature change. And you can see it's a pretty straightforward relationship. The more that we're emitting, the higher the temperatures grow. And one thing to point out is if you look down here at this scenario where we are decreasing emissions basically down to zero by the end of the century, doesn't mean, of course, we stop breathing, right? There are ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere by planting trees, allowing forests to regrow. And so what's happening in this kind of scenario is that in a given year, you're only emitting as much CO2 as is being taken out of the atmosphere in that year. But that's actually the kind of pathway that we would need to hit in order to end up with something in the vicinity of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And that's actually the level of warming that people have in mind when they talk about avoiding dangerous climate change. And as you can imagine from the goal of hitting zero net emissions, that would require a lot more aggressive intervention than a lot more aggressive action than we see anybody really adopting today. On the other hand, right, if we don't take any action to try to reduce our emissions, then outcomes could end up very different. And so you might end up in one of these higher scenarios with around 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of warming. And when you look at these different kinds of scenarios, two different kinds of questions emerge, right? The first kind of question is what, if anything, should we do to reduce the amount of climate change that's going to occur? So what kinds of measures should we take to maybe get away from those higher curves and toward those lower curves? But a different kind of question is, given that some climate change is going to occur, how should we respond to the impacts that start to fall on people? And in this talk, I'm actually going to be focusing on that second kind of question and not so much talking about the first. And the key idea is that you have these different scenarios and they come with different levels of danger. But every scenario has some danger. Every scenario has some amount of warming and some amount of risk. And we need to think about how to handle those impacts. And if we're only talking about preventing impacts, then that's going to be unfair to the people who are inevitably going to be victimized kind of no matter what we do. It's also going to leave us unprepared to handle these difficult situations in a graceful way. So for the sake of discussion, let's just focus on a kind of unattractive scenario, which is one where basically nothing is done to try to control emissions over the coming years. When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models scenarios like this, they come up with an average result of about 3.66 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century, and that creates losses that correspond to about 2.6% of global GDP. But notice that's only the average result in these models. So when you run the model, right, there are lots of chance events that could happen or they could not happen, right? And that might have a major impact on what actually ends up happening to people in that scenario. So maybe a hurricane hits Miami, right? In one model run, maybe the same hurricane misses Miami in a different model, or maybe there isn't that hurricane, And so, you run the model lots of times, you get lots of different outcomes, and so you end up with a range of impacts, even with the same kind of basic assumptions in place. And so you have a range of different outcomes here. In the 5%, in the worst 5% of those model runs, you end up with losses of upward of 8.2% of world GDP. And if you think about how much economic value there is created in the world, losing 8.2% of it to climate-related impacts is many trillions of dollars of damage kind of every year going forward. So you've got more fires, more floods, more droughts, more heat waves, and so on and so forth every year into the future, causing trillions of dollars in losses per year. For the sake of simplicity, I'm kind of focusing on these IPCC projections, and it's worth noting that there are a variety of other projections that people have come up with for what the future will be like. Some of them project even worse things like the Stern Review. Some project less severe impacts like some of William Nordhaus's earlier work. But basically, these are kind of differences in the details. They all kind of support the same basic picture that I've just been sketching. And for my purposes, more importantly, it's also interesting that these kinds of projections all share a basic moral outlook. And I'm going to call that moral outlook the typical gloss that is given on the moral issue that's raised by climate change. So according to this typical gloss, as I've been saying, short of some kind of political miracle, climate change is going to cause trillions of dollars of damages, potentially many trillions of dollars of damage every year into the future. And I'm talking in dollar terms, but you could make the same points in terms of deaths, in terms of displacements, and so on and so forth. And the thought is that all of this bad stuff is morally bad, right? This is a case of people today inflicting serious harms on people in the future. And there might be some difficult questions that you might want to ask about exactly who is to blame, how should we apportion the culpability for this, what should we do about it? But it doesn't detract from the basic idea that the people who have contributed to climate change today are going to be responsible for these bad things that happen in the future. They're morally on the hook for them. And insofar as that's true, insofar as we're in this situation where people today are wrongfully inflicting harms on future people, right, the upshot is that we should take action to reduce those harms. It would be morally repugnant for us to fail to do that. So this is the kind of typical gloss that you'll hear on the sort of ethical issues that are raised by climate change. Hopefully it's kind of familiar if you're familiar with the climate change debate. What I want to argue in this talk is that that narrative is importantly misleading. And the problem has to do with the way that the narrative leads us to think about the moral significance of climate change-induced harms. So let me unpack that idea. Harm is a central concept in morality. It's arguably the paradigmatic form of wrongdoing, right? So here's little bunny Foo-Foo. He's going through the forest, scooping up innocent field mice, potentially giving them concussions, right? He's a horrible individual. He's rightly punished. So this is a pretty straightforward case, but not all cases of harming are as straightforward from a moral perspective as this one. So consider these people who are opening a new business. It could turn out that there's some guy down the street who is now, going to have lots of hardship because he's going to lose customers as a result of this new competitor opening up nearby, right? Plausibly, there's a kind of harm there, right? The existing store owner is harmed by this new competition, but that harm isn't necessarily morally problematic. Right? It's not morally wrong that these people have opened their business. In fact, they have a right to do this. If that makes the competitor worse off, then that's the competitor's problem. Right? And we can kind of say the same thing with this woman who's enjoying her beautifully layered cocktail at the bar when this lonely fellow decides that he wants to strike up a conversation with her. Right? If she tells him to get lost and let her enjoy her drink in peace, plausibly that's a kind of harm to him. But it also seems pretty clear that it's not morally bad or wrong for her to do that, right? The fact that he's been harmed is not a sort of moral complaint. So what we see from cases like these is that if harm just means something sort of simple, like adversely affect, then some harms are just going to turn out not to be very significant from the standpoint of morality, right? Even though harm is a central moral concept, the moral significance of harms can vary between different kinds of contexts. On the other hand, I do want to stress that just because harm is not immoral, it doesn't mean that it's not sad or tragic or something like that, right? So if this guy got put out of work because these competitors opened up down the street, that sucks for him. That's a tragedy that we shouldn't necessarily ignore, right? We might even want to help this guy out. Even the creepy guy at the bar, right, he might have to endure rejection and loneliness and sadness, right? Maybe he has no moral complaint about what's happened to him, but that doesn't mean we have to completely ignore the bad things that this guy has to deal with. So these cases illustrate how harm can be tragic without being morally wrong. And they also give us one reason why harm can be morally insignificant, right? In particular, in these cases, we see harm isn't wrong when it arises from people just legitimately exercising their individual rights. But there are other kinds of harms that have reduced significance as well. And for this talk, it's going to be particularly important that the moral significance of a harm is diminished if its victims voluntarily put themselves into harm's way or neglect to get out of harm's way. So I'm going to argue for this point, but that's the claim. And here's an example. Imagine I go to a baseball game and I get distracted eating my hot dog, and while I'm not paying attention, fly ball flies through the air and smacks me in the side of the head. I could be seriously harmed by that, right? But it wouldn't mean that I'd been wronged. People who choose to go to baseball games, they voluntarily take on certain kinds of risks. And if those risks eventuate, right, it might be tragic and sad, but it doesn't mean that those people have been wronged in some kind of morally important way. And notice that what's doing the work here is a little bit different, right? This isn't a case of somebody just exercising their rights in an independently justifiable way, right? No one has a right to just send baseballs flying at high speeds at strangers, right? So if I'm walking down the street and somebody hits a baseball into my head, plausibly that person is responsible for the harm that has befallen me, right? What makes cases like this one morally innocuous is that the people who are harmed are only harmed because of risks that they voluntarily took on. So that's a case where harm is less significant because somebody voluntarily took on a risk. But here's a different case. So imagine that you're on a hike up a mountain, and suddenly a mountain biker comes speeding around the corner, and they're out of control, right? Suppose the mountain biker sees you in the path, and she shouts like, "Hey, get out of the way, I can't stop," right? And suppose that you have plenty of time, right? You see her coming, all you would need to do is step to the side. But suppose that instead of stepping to the side, you say, "Bring it on," right? And you get hit. Now, this is a case where you didn't voluntarily put yourself into danger, right? Plausibly, the mountain biker did that by riding recklessly down the hill. But even so, it seems like the moral significance of this harm that's been done to you is reduced by the fact that you had the opportunity to get out of the way and you chose not to do that, right? And so the point I want to make about cases like these, again, right, is just that the moral significance of a harm is diminished if its victims either voluntarily put themselves into harm's way, like the person at the baseball game, or they neglect to get out of harm's way when they had ample opportunity to do that, like the person in the mountain bike example. And notice that I'm saying diminished, right, and not eliminated, right? So plausibly in the mountain biker case, the mountain biker bears some responsibility for what happens to you in virtue of the fact that she's behaved recklessly, right? But the point is just that compared to a case where you're just harmed without warning by somebody who's behaving in a reckless or malicious way, the moral gravity of a harm is diminished, not eliminated, if the victims had the opportunity to get out of the way or stay out of the way. So now let's think about how all of that applies to the case of climate change. So I was talking about there being more and worse fires and floods and droughts and heat waves and so on, trillions of dollars of damages every year into the future, right? But notice the time scale on which those dangers are projected to emerge, right? So there's lots of evidence that climate change is already having impacts on people around the world today. But the most severe effects are projected to unfold over the coming decades, right? And what that means is that a lot of the people who are going to be victimized by climate change, most of the people who are going to be victimized by climate change, are going to be people who will have been aware of the problem for a number of years, perhaps even decades, perhaps even their whole life. And they'll have had a long time to prepare for the possible impacts that are likely to befall them. So just to take one illustration, so this city on the coast is eventually going to be threatened by things like rising sea levels, increased storm flooding, things like that. It already faces some risk of that today. But in 50 or 100 years, those risks are going to be a lot bigger than they are today because of climate change. But if you look closer at that city, you'll see lots of people moving in and out of the city over the next 50 or 100 years. Right? The people who make up the current workforce of the city are going to be deciding where they want to spend their retirement. Their kids are going to be growing up, deciding where they want to build their lives. The properties that are eventually going to be threatened by climate change might change hands multiple times between now and then. A lot of that property probably doesn't even exist yet. So existing assets are going to be torn down. New investments are going to be made in their place. And so given all of that stuff that's happening in the city over the next 50 or 100 years, it seems pretty plausible that in 50 or 100 years, virtually everyone and everything in a coastal city like this one is going to have some connection to somebody's choice to either put themselves into harm's way or at least not get out of harm's way despite having had lots of opportunity to do so. And if that's true, and if my earlier analysis was correct, then when climate change produces impacts like these, it won't be appropriate to think about them like ordinary cases of harm, right? They'll be a lot less like somebody being attacked by a hammer-wielding rabbit in the forest, and a lot more like somebody, getting hit by a foul ball when they've chosen to go to a baseball game. So let me just present a younger version of myself as an illustration of what I'm talking about. So until this past summer, I was teaching at UNC Chapel Hill. And if I had stayed in North Carolina, I would have been protected from many of the worst impacts of climate change. Not all of them, right? In a warming world, there are going to be some risks that, just in virtue of the climate system being in flux, you're going to have to deal with certain kinds of dangers, right? But North Carolina is not going to be the epicenter of the climate change catastrophe, right? On the other hand, I got this really great job offer at the University of New Orleans. And so I moved to New Orleans, right? Which among American cities is probably at least one of the most imperiled places in the country, right? For one thing, a lot of the city is already below sea level, right? So here is a depiction of the city of New Orleans. The green parts are the parts that are above sea level. The yellow parts are already below sea level. And as sea level rises, and as the land continues to sink, which it has been doing, this is only going to get worse. And on top of that, right, we're also kind of right in the middle of an area that is consistently threatened by hurricanes. So here is the 2018 hurricane season. Here was 2017, right? And so constantly threatened by hurricanes. And the problem isn't just the overall level of the ocean or damage from hurricane winds. So this is what New Orleans looks like from the side in terms of its topography. And this dotted line here is sea level, right? And you can see some parts of the city are below sea level. But there's also this area on the left here, right, which is the Mississippi River. And rivers flow downhill, so the Mississippi is actually considerably above sea level. And the river is held in place by a kind of natural levee that's been set down from silt and dirt being carried by the river. There's also a big flood wall to protect the city, right? But there is this sort of big water course that's threatening you with flooding. On the other side is Lake Pontchartrain. That's directly connected to the ocean, so it's much closer to sea level. But if there's a hurricane, water can get pushed into the lake and cause the waters to rise. And so along the lakefront, we have levees and storm walls to protect us there. But the problem, as you can see, right, is that if water gets into the city, right, it's a giant bowl that will just keep the water inside, inundating everything that's in it. And to the city's credit, right, they understand this, and so they have a big drainage system to try and pull water out in case the city gets flooded. But the system can only handle so much. There have historically been problems with the pumps failing or being out of service. And if one of these flood walls fails, then you're just kind of out of luck, right? If the city of New Orleans is, taking in the Mississippi River, no pump is going to be able to stop that. And actually, it doesn't take a hurricane or a flood wall failure to kind of overwhelm things. This was just a big rainstorm that happened in July. Not a hurricane, not a record or anything. Just, we got about 7 inches of rain in 6 hours. The pumps couldn't keep up, and a lot of people's cars got flooded out. Right? So here's the thing. I knew all of this stuff before I moved to New Orleans. Right? I have voluntarily put myself into harm's way. And you might ask, well, why would you do that? And the answer is, well, like lots of things in life, there are bad things and there are good things. Right? New Orleans is an incredible, one-of-a-kind city. I had an opportunity to take an amazing job at a great up-and-coming university. All things considered, right, the package was worth taking. The risks were worth taking. But my point is just that if New Orleans faces another catastrophe, right, after I made this decision to move there, I'm going to bear some responsibility for what happens to me as a result of that. And the point that I'm trying to make sort of more generally is that if we fast forward to the year 2100, right, that same analysis is going to apply to a lot of the people who are threatened by climate change in cities like this one, right? They will be in harm's way because they made certain choices that came with certain benefits as well as certain risks. And to the extent that that's true, right, to the extent that they voluntarily took those risks on, or at least didn't get out of the way of those risks, then the moral gravity of the harms that eventually befall them is going to be significantly reduced by the fact that they've sort of made those choices. Now, at this point you might be thinking, okay, Donnie, maybe you're right about people like you who have lots of choices about, where you live, how you live. That's a pretty, fortunate situation to be in. Lots of people, though, not so fortunate, right? To take the extreme case, hundreds of millions of people in the world still live on less than $2 a day, right? And about half of the world population lives on less than $5.50 a day, right? Works out to about $2,000 a year. If you're a subsistence farmer in rural Bangladesh who's living on less than $2,000 a year, it's not really that fair to say to that person, oh, I'm sorry that your crops failed, right? Why didn't you, move somewhere else that had fewer risks or take up a different line of work? Why didn't you do more to protect yourself, right? Those are tough questions to pose to anybody who is dealing with hardship, right? But I don't necessarily think that they're out of place for people who are living in cities like this one, right? These are people who, have lots of choices about where they're going to live, what they're going to do for a living. They also tend to know that climate change is coming. There are lots of options that they have for protecting themselves. But people who live in places like this, right, aren't necessarily choosing to be in harm's way. Right? They're often in harm's way because they don't have much of a choice. And there are lots of reasons why people might find themselves in a situation like that. So let's just kind of talk through some of them, right? Starting with insufficient material wealth. So, I've already kind of mentioned material poverty, but if you kind of look through the statistics, this is from a World Bank report from last year. In 2013, nearly 12% of households on Earth subsisted on less than $1.90 per person per day, and that's a lot higher in sub-Saharan Africa, closer to half of households in that situation. And we see that poverty reflected in a variety of other indicators as well that kind of go beyond money, right? So nearly 16% of households didn't have access to electricity, and that's 1 in 4 South Asians, nearly 2 in 3 Sub-Saharan Africans, right? Almost a quarter of people on Earth didn't have access to basic sanitation, right? About 11% lacked access to clean drinking water, right? And it's not just about wealth, right? So in many cases, people just don't have the kind of education that would be needed to really understand the risks that they face in a warming world and what their options are for doing something about those risks, right? So from the same report in 2013, about 17% of households on Earth didn't contain a single adult who had completed a 9th grade education, right? Again, it's higher in sub-Saharan Africa, closer to half. 9% of households had a child of primary school age who wasn't enrolled in school, right? So you've got poverty, you've got lack of education, and in addition to all of that, a lot of people are kind of locked in place by policies that restrict their movement from one place to another, right? So we've heard a lot lately about immigration restrictions in the United States, but every developed country has pretty strict limits on who can move there from a different country, right? On the flip side, there are some countries that require exit visas if you want to leave the country. And that can be difficult to get in certain countries. And even within countries, there are sometimes restrictions on who is allowed to move where and under what circumstances. So in China, if you want to move to a new place, you have to get the government to approve your request to relocate. And if you don't get approval, then you're basically an illegal immigrant in your new place of residence. And a lot of people do it anyway, just like lots of people illegally immigrate, across country lines. But it obviously makes things much harder for people to just sort of up and move if you're not allowed to do that without getting the government's permission. And in some countries, women especially face really severe obstacles even to moving around their own community, right? So in Yemen, for example, it's possible for a woman to be arrested for even leaving her house and moving around her own community if her husband objects and wants to issue a complaint about this, right? So even if somebody like me is responsible for the harms that befall me because of the choices that I've made, right? The same thing isn't going to be true of people, who face these kinds of challenges that I've just been describing, of lacking adequate material wealth, lacking a basic education, facing really dire barriers to movement, right? When people have obstacles like those, they aren't going to be like people who've chosen to be at a baseball game and get hit by a foul ball, right? They're a lot more like the field mice in the bunny foo-foo story, right? They're out doing the best that they can. The people who are causing climate change are just wrongfully harming them, right? And I want to grant all of that. And I think it does highlight some limits of the analysis that I've been presenting, right? But I actually don't see that as a problem for the view. On the contrary, I actually think it helps to show why the view is so important and why it needs to change the way that we respond to and think about the problem of climate change. So let's go back to the typical gloss on the problem of climate change that I started with. So on that account, the problem of climate change was that it was going to cause massive harm, right? And the solution to the problem was just to reduce that harm. What I'm arguing is that that's a misleading way to think about the issue. A lot of the harms that are caused by climate change are going to be much less significant than you might think from a moral point of view, because for people who live in places like this, right, they are going to be in harm's way mostly because of choices that they have made, right? And they're going to have a lot of responsibility for the dangers that they face because of those choices. The real problems of climate change have to do with obstacles like this, right? These are the things that make it unfeasible for people to make robust choices about the risks that they face in a warming world, right? And so if that's right, then contrary to the standard narrative of climate change, right, our moral imperative is not to just reduce harm as such, right? It might even turn out that a better way to tackle the problem of climate change is to focus on addressing these sources of vulnerability, right? So to help people to escape from material poverty, to help people to get a more adequate education, to help people move around more freely in the world. If we remove these kinds of obstacles to people making choices and taking control of their lives, then we enable them to take more responsibility for the harms that they face in a warming world. And for all we know, those people might use their opportunities to move to places like this or live in places like this, right? They might do exactly what I did and move to New Orleans, right? But if that's true, right, an effective climate policy might actually result in a counterintuitive result, right? It might actually result in more people being harmed rather than less. But the key point is just that if people are getting harmed in this kind of scenario, right, they are getting harmed because of choices that they have made to voluntarily take on certain risks. From a moral point of view, the gravity of these harms would be significantly reduced, right? It would count as a solution. So instead of just trying to reduce harms, what my approach is recommending is to empower people to make better choices about what risks they are going to bear. And that might not actually lead to a reduction in harm. If people choose to put themselves into harm's way, right, you could actually see harm go up. But you would reduce the kind of harm that is morally problematic, right? The harms that are just being inflicted on people, whether or not they have a choice in the matter. So just to summarize what I've argued so far, a lot of climate change-induced harms are going to have sharply diminished moral significance relative to what you might otherwise think. And the most serious harms are going to be the ones that affect people who can't get out of the way. What that means is that a sophisticated response to climate change isn't necessarily going to be focused just on reducing harm. It's going to be focused on empowering people to make choices for themselves about what they want to have happen to them. So before we kind of wrap up, I do want to talk about another objection that's come up in a lot of times that I've presented this talk. And it's a really interesting one, particularly interested in it in context of being with in a setting where we're focused on families and thinking about culture. It seems like this might be a natural thing for people to say, so I'm interested to hear what you guys think about this stuff. But so I've been talking about people having a responsibility for what risks they take on, right? And that makes sense when we're talking about people who are in some sense making choices about where they're going to live, where they're going to build their life, and so on. But a lot of people find themselves in certain places not because they chose to be there, right? But because that's just kind of where they were born and raised. So you might ask, if people find themselves somewhere and they face certain risks, right, and they could move out of the way, don't they have some right to stay put? Don't they have some right not to be displaced from their home because of what other people are sort of doing? And this is an especially big issue in New Orleans, where I'm coming from, right? You have lots of families that have spent generations in the same neighborhood, sometimes even in the same house, right? And for these people, it's not as simple as just saying, well, if you don't want to be at risk, then why don't you just move, right? Maybe the problem isn't necessarily that they can't move, right? Oftentimes they could. It's just that if they were to move, they would have to leave behind, right, their lives, their jobs, their friends, their families, their homes, their communities, their history, right? If people in that kind of situation see risk on the horizon, they decide to stay. It's hard to say, well, okay, then it's your problem if something bad happens to you, right? And you can kind of see the issue come out when you think back to the hiker example that we went through earlier. So in that example, when the bike comes over the hill, right, all the hiker needs to do to get out of danger is sort of step to the side, right? And it's no big deal for the hiker to do that. And that's part of what makes it make sense to say that if the hiker doesn't step to the side, right, then he's responsible for, what damage befalls him as a result. But when you're looking at somebody who's built their whole life in a particular place, right, getting out of the way of climate change is not just a matter of kind of stepping to the side, right? It's not really even clearly a way of getting out of the way of harm. It's more a way of trading one harm, the harm of climate change, for a different harm, the harm of being a displaced person who's been uprooted from their community, right? So you're losing certain risks, but you're taking on certain, sure costs. So what I've been saying is that the moral significance of harm is diminished if the victims voluntarily put themselves into or neglect to get out of harm's way, right? But if there's no way to prevent harm from occurring, right, this statement isn't going to apply, right? If you're just trading one harm for another, then it's not that you didn't get out of harm's way, right? You were you were in trouble no matter what you did. So to some extent, I'm going to want to agree with the spirit of this objection, right? People do have a right not to be displaced from their homes. My account shouldn't let polluters off the hook for harming people who are kind of embedded in these long-standing communities of place. But at the same time, even though I agree with the spirit of the objection, I don't want to totally concede this point, and there are two reasons for that. The first is that there are lots of things that people can do to protect themselves from the harms of climate change without moving, right? So for example, in New Orleans, people who are threatened by flooding, often live in houses with raised foundations or with other kinds of structural modifications to protect them from being inundated in the case of a storm. If you're in a place that often experiences extreme weather events like hurricanes, people often have emergency kits to either help them stay safe while the hurricane is hitting, or so that they can get the heck out of the city really quickly if a storm seems to be bearing down. In some areas like New Orleans, you can sign up for phone alerts to tell you what's actually coming, right? And even something as simple as just making sure that your air conditioner is in good working order and all of your home appliances are working. They can protect you from certain kinds of bad things, right? They can protect you from overheating. Keeping your heating system in good repair could help you avoid getting too cold. So if you choose to build your life in a risky place, right, and you don't do things like this, then that seems like a reason to think that you bear some responsibility for harms that befall you, independent of the idea of, oh, well, you could have moved, right? A second reason to want to resist the objection is also linked to the time span that a lot of these dangers are going to be materializing. So remember, we've been talking about harms that mostly aren't going to materialize for a period of decades. And by 2100, the people who we're most worried about here, the people in this picture, for example, those people are unfortunately not going to be with us anymore, right? The people who are going to see the worst impacts of climate change are only now being born, right? They haven't yet developed rich attachments to particular communities and particular places. Those kids are going to grow up in a world where climate change is just a known part of their future. They are going to need to make decisions in light of that about where they want to live, how they want to build their lives, right? And by the time things get really bad, those new babies are actually going to be retiring, right? And it's going to be their kids and their grandkids who are navigating a warmer world. And so if these upcoming generations of people choose, after knowing their entire lives of the dangers that are in their future, they choose to build their life in the same place that their parents lived and their grandparents lived. Do they bear any responsibility for the dangers that come along with those choices? I actually think that's a really difficult question, right? If people choose to build their lives in their forebears' communities, does that insulate them from being responsible for the risks that they face as a result? One view on this issue would be that as you move further into the future and start getting more and more generations away from the present, right, it becomes more and more plausible that people are responsible if they want to sort of maintain the life that their parents lived before them. On the other hand, I expect lots of people are going to disagree with that stance and say, no, people have a right to integrate into the community and life of their forebears. And that's just a basic claim that everybody has. And as unsatisfying as it is, I don't want to try to settle that issue in the context of this talk. Instead, for the sake of discussion, I just want to sort of concede that point and say, look, if people are harmed by climate change because they are choosing to stay in long-standing communities where they have deep long-term ties, and they've taken appropriate measures to protect themselves in place, right, then the moral gravity of bad things that happen to them is not diminished by the fact that they could have uprooted themselves and gone and lived somewhere else, right? Let's just concede that point, right? What follows for that? Well, it means that in addition to empowering people who can't choose what risks they face, we're also going to want to prioritize these long-standing communities, right? This is going to be another priority for climate policy. But notice that that doesn't change the overarching point of the talk, right? So we started out by discussing this standard gloss that you typically hear on the moral issue that's presented by climate change. So that narrative, again, is that climate change is going to cause trillions of dollars in damages. Those harms are going to be visited on future people, by people today. That is a moral affront. And the people who have caused climate change are responsible for that affront. What that means is that if we want to sort of get on the right side of morality, we've got to reduce the harms. That's the standard gloss that you get on the problem of climate change. What I've been arguing is that that narrative is misleading, right? If we think about the far-off impacts of climate change, the worst impacts of climate change, a lot of those harms are going to fall on people who are going to be exposed to risk because of choices that they made, right? These people are not going to be in harm's way primarily because they have deep attachments to particular places. They're going to be in harm's way because they were doing what I did, right? They're going to be in harm's way because they had different opportunities available to them. The opportunities came with certain benefits as well as certain risks, and they chose the opportunities that represented the best options for them and their family, right? My point is that when we set priorities for climate change policy, those are not the kinds of people who our main focus should be on, right? The real people who we need to focus on are the people who are truly victimized by these climatic changes, the people who don't have the ability to choose what risks they're going to face, and perhaps also the people who are exposed to these risks because they really couldn't get out of the way of them without seriously damaging themselves. Right? These are the kinds of people we need to focus on when we're setting priorities for climate policy. And if that's right, then it fundamentally changes how we think about the impacts of climate change. Right? It takes the focus off of the size of the impacts as such, and it pushes us to focus on the specific kinds of situations that are most important from a moral perspective. So thank you guys so much for listening. I'm really excited to hear what you guys think. Donnie Shahar, and that's my talk.